Howdy all, welcome back and namaste. So we're starting now chapter 4 on sex and death, and I always start this class, when I'm teaching in the classroom, I always start it with that track, that video by Mac Miller. Y'all know that track? Yeah, Mac Miller? And usually everybody in the room already knows why I chose that track. Usually everybody in the room already knows that song, and the tragedy of Mac Miller's life. Not the tragedy of his life, but the tragedy of his death, which occurred due to a drug overdose. Yeah. More specifically, he was, he got some bad junk from his dealer, who's now in jail for 11 years. Just convicted a couple of months ago. Cocaine and fentanyl, and anytime you go anywhere near fentanyl, there's a high chance that you won't make it, right? Fentanyl is one of the leading causes of death in our world today. Fentanyl's bad stuff. Yeah, and the title of this track is Self-Care. So the tragedy of his death, having not taken care of himself. And self-care obviously not meaning just physically, but also, right, taking care of ourselves emotionally, taking care of ourselves, mentally, right? Taking our own mental health seriously, which is, definitely an aspect of philosophy. And there's a lot of philosophy in Mac Miller's songs. A lot of his music is about death and, like on Faces, he's like Inside Outside, which is the lead track on the album Faces, the mixtape Faces that dropped recently. It was he recorded in 2017. He says, all my homies philosophers, and I don't know how I haven't died yet. I should have died already. So there's a lot on the surface of why this particular music video, Self-Care by Mac Miller, is relevant, right, to our understanding of the philosophy of death and the relationship between philosophy and death and anthropology and existentialism and ontology and all these things that we've been talking about. This video lays it all out for us. And even before we even talk about the content of the video, but just the fact that it's called Self-Care and it's by Mac Miller, who's no longer with us, sadly. But then, brief interruption there, because my son just won solo on Fortnite, so we had to pause and celebrate. But in this video, right, so we've got not just those layers on the surface, right? Mac Miller, who's no longer with us, talking about self-care and mental health care, and which he didn't, and so therefore led to depression and drug use associated therewith, which then led to his death, which is right. So the relationship between philosophy and death are laid out there even before we talk about the content of the video. What do you think the visual message of the video is? What would you take away from it? But then we see him right in a coffin. So he's in a coffin. Again, layers of meaning there. But as he's, after he smokes a cigarette, then he starts carving into this roof, or whatever you call it. I don't know what you call it, inside of a coffin. Yeah, so climbing out of the coffin, like getting away from death. The top, right, inside of the roof. It can sound like a home, which I guess it was for him. Maybe some layers of meaning there, kind of buried in the cave, right? And he's breaking out. But what enables him to break out is by carving this in the ceiling, right? Memento Mori. And that becomes his passageway, his means of communication, or going through this tunnel. All right, I want to jump in here and add another layer of meaning. Before his death in 2004, this philosopher named Jacques Derrida gave a speech. Now, he gave the speech in person, in public, and mostly in French. The speech was about how words communicate meaning through passageways of space and time. Words go from one context to another context. The person who speaks the words might have one intended meaning when the words are spoken, and the intended audience might take a different meaning than the one that was intended. But suppose that speech is written down and translated into a different language, like English, and then put on the internet, and then put in a YouTube video, in a screenshot, side by side, with a picture of Mac Miller in a coffin, carving the Latin words, Memento Mori, before breaking a passageway out of his coffin. Hypothetically. Now, suppose, hypothetically, that someone watches that YouTube video. What kind of meaning are they going to take away from it? What meaning gets communicated through this passageway of space-time? the event of Derrida's speech, the event of Mac Miller's recording his video, the event of my recorded lecture, the event of my classroom lecture, the event of my writing the words of this script, the event of my recording this clip, the event of you watching this right now, which is definitely a very different right now than the right now in which I wrote these words or spoke these words. All of this. The words that Mac Miller spoke, the visual image of Mac Miller in a coffin, the words Memento Mori carved in Latin in the coffin, Jacques Derrida's words about how words communicate to people in the future, to people who were born after Derrida's death. My words right now. All of these words and images get layered on top of each other, and all of it communicates some meaning from one event in space-time to another. And the words and images continue to communicate meaning after Derrida's death, after Mac Miller's death, and perhaps after my own death, assuming YouTube outlives me. Assuming YouTube outlives me. After my own death, assuming that YouTube outlives me. Of getting out of his cave, right, his coffin. And he carves this phrase in Latin into the wood, which says Memento Mori. What does Memento Mori mean? Anybody know? Latin? So Memento Mori, memento meaning like remember, and mori meaning death, which in Latin means remember that you will die. Remember death. Remember death. Remember the reality of death. You will die. Don't forget that death is always there, always behind the scenes, right? And the point of this entire chapter, all of these different parts we're going to talk about, we're going to boil it down. We can call this my thesis statement for chapter 4. The thesis statement is this, that philosophy only begins with a meaningful reflection on the reality of death. Philosophy only begins with a meaningful reflection on the reality of death. Only then, that is the genesis of philosophy. Philosophy's genesis, philosophy's beginning, is a meaningful reflection on the reality of death. Right. Philosophy only begins with a meaningful reflection on the reality of death. Worth repeating. Which on your mind? What are you thinking? Sure. Yeah, so when we think about what does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be an I, right? What does it mean to be, or what does it mean to be Brad, right? When we think about ourselves and what does it mean to be who we are, a lot of times who we are has to do with our relationships, right? And with our parents and with our loved ones and, kids and families, right? And all this kind of stuff. So then when those relationships end, whether it's because somebody dies or somebody leaves or for any reason, then that's a death of one version of yourself at the least. Could also be a death of innocence, a death of, right? But it's a death of innocence is also a death of self, isn't it? Death of who you are, which then can spin you into depression for sure, right? What are some other possibilities? Alternatives to depression? Doesn't have to send you into depression, does it? There's some other ways of dealing with like the end of a relationship or the death of a pet. Right. So those are ways of escaping, right? Escaping the reality, escaping the memory. There's a Dave Matthews song, "Bartender, please give me one drink to remember and another one to forget," right? So yeah, those forms of escape, right? And so Mac Miller, I think, was caught in that too. I mean, come on, who wouldn't be depressed if Ariana Grande broke up with you? Am I wrong? What do you think about that other line, "I got all the time in the world"? Isn't that kind of a denial of death, right? I mean, yeah. Yeah. Does that line and this whole song, the whole video, does it kind of hit differently after his death than it did before? Yeah, I think maybe what you're getting at is, you could take that line in two very different ways, right? One is being like after death, that beautiful feeling of oblivion, when you have no limit to time or all the time in the world. Or it could be, before. So what does he mean? Mac Miller probably can mean more than one thing at a time. He's a pretty smart guy. Yeah, all right, so this already told you is the thesis statement of the chapter. So the chapter setting course, InterCourse, DisCourse, and death, thinking more about what is the point? What is the point? What's the point of being? What's the point of life? To live. That's not a bad answer. So the point of life is to live. So then, if the point of life is to live it, then
YOLO.
Why not live it to the fullest, right?
YOLO.
Make it fun, make it enjoyable.
YOLO.
Right? That's a good philosophy.
YOLO.
I mean, it's all going to end the same way, right? No matter what, death awaits. It's all going to end in death. Most of us are going to be forgotten, right? No one's going to remember our names. No one's going to remember what we did. Maybe for like 30, 40, 50 years, a generation or two, right? But I mean, like, do you even know your great-grandparents or your great-great-grandparents' names? I mean, you got a bunch of them. Could you remember all of them? Maybe you remember one or two, but most of us are going to be forgotten eventually, right? In the meantime, we live in a world that's kind of surrounded by, like, injustice and unfairness and, you know, is that true? So then what's the point of any of it? What's the point? All right, so imagine with me, I wanted to...
When I would normally teach this class,
I want you to picture...
we would talk here about...
this young kid. This kid that was born into, like, super wealthy family, right? Born into privilege, every kind of privilege you could think. I mean, wealth, power, opportunity, everything. Parents loved him, great, all that kind of stuff. And they gave him everything he ever wanted. He never wanted for anything. Never had any needs that were unfulfilled, anything like that. They were kind of like helicopter parents, you know, like always protecting him from, right, seeing the realities of the world. You didn't want him to, like, know about the suffering and injustice and poverty and things that were out there in the world, because that's, right? I mean, the point of life is to live it. The point of life is to enjoy it. The point of life is to be happy. And if you got wealth and power and privilege and money, then, you know, you've got the opportunity to enjoy it and to live it to the fullest. So why, you know, depress yourself or risk depressing the kid by learning about the injustices of the world or inequality or suffering or poverty or any of those kind of things, right? Violence. So he never saw any poverty. He never saw any... He was kind of sheltered from he was sheltered from the realities of the world. Never saw violence or starvation or disease or suffering. And then one day when he got older, when he was an adult, he got a little bored and thought, you know, I want to go out and see some of the world, right? Now that I'm an adult, I can make decisions for myself. And he wanted to go out and see the world, you know, that his parents had been sheltering him from. And so he goes out and he sees all this cool shit, right? All this cool culture, people that are different and foods that are different and, you know, right, partying and all this kind of, you know, just the world had this a whole different level of color and diversity and all this kind of cool stuff. But then he also started to notice, you know, not just the excitement and adventure, but he saw this old woman begging on the side of the road for foods, and she was very old. She couldn't like see very well. She couldn't hear very well. She couldn't do any work or anything like that, right? And she didn't have anybody. Or she was just on her own, right? Just this poor old woman on the side of the road begging for food, and her survival depended on the charity of others, right? Whether other people would help her, feed her, and if they didn't, then she'd die. And he saw this child, a little child that was didn't have legs. So you know, a person with a disability that didn't have legs, and they were also begging because they couldn't take care of themselves, and that nobody there to. So they were dependent on the charity and the welfare of others. And then he saw this funeral, like all these people that were like crying and mourning, and because their loved one had died, and he saw these other people around. So they're like some people walking down the street carrying a coffin, like mourning the death of their loved one, and other people that are just kind of going along their business, like not really paying much attention, not involved in the funeral or whatever. Some people that are just seem to be having a good time and just doing their normal thing, and it just really bothered him. He got super depressed from all of that. He just wondered, like, what is the point of all of it? He got super depressed. It's depressing, isn't it? So he got super depressed and decided that he didn't know how to deal with it. All the injustice and equality and the randomness of the suffering. Like, it didn't seem like the people that were suffering deserved it or anything. It just seemed like some people got born into wealthy families and got privilege and got, opportunities. And other people didn't. There didn't seem to be any really rhyme or reason or logic to it. So he gave up. He got depressed, and he, didn't exactly go into alcohol or drugs, but instead just became, suicidally depressed. And so he just sat down and he gave up. And he's like, I don't want to do anything anymore. I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to do anything. I'm just going to sit here on my ass. And he wanted to die. Feel that? Yay. So he was sitting there trying to figure out the point of it all. And he realized a few things. That story didn't end there. But he became a philosopher at that moment. A philosopher whose name we still remember thousands of years later. You want to know what he figured out? Do you want to know? What, you know? You know what I'm talking about, huh? So, what did he realize? I mean, he's sitting there. He decided that he was going to sit there and stop eating. He stopped eating and decided he was either going to starve to death or figure out the meaning and purpose of life, right? And if he figured out the meaning and purpose of life, then he'd eat. And if he didn't, he'd die, right? Either way, it's over. He did figure it out. And so he kind of, as he was sitting there, he realized, I can't fix all the injustice, right? I can't solve all of the injustice. I can't solve all of the suffering. I can't alleviate all of the suffering, right, around me. I can't end injustice. I can't defeat death, right? Any of those kind of things. But he realized this. Write this down, I think. If life is meaningful, then, it's a little logic proof, then if life is meaningful, then each moment is meaningful. Or, say the same thing in the other way around. If each moment is meaningful, then life is meaningful. True? If life is meaningful, then maybe not every moment is meaningful, but a lot of them have to be, right? A lot of moments have to be meaningful in order for life to be meaningful. But if each moment is meaningful, then life as a whole has meaning, right? If every moment has a purpose, then life as a whole has a purpose, right? So he was sitting there dejected and depressed because life had no meaning and no purpose. And he was right. Right? Why was he right? Is it meaningful or purposeful to sit on your ass underneath a tree while people around you are suffering? No. But if you get up off of your ass, why was he was starving to death, right? He was starving to death. But why was he starving to death? He wasn't starving to death because he was poor. He wasn't starving to death because he couldn't work. He wasn't starving to death because he didn't have food. He had all of those things, right? He had access to all of those things. He wasn't eating because he was depressed, which is very different than not eating because you don't have food, right? And there were people around him that were starving because they didn't have food, right? So he could get up off of his ass and go and get food and give it to the people who were starving. Is that meaningful? So then if you make every moment meaningful, then life as a whole is meaningful. How's that land? What do you think? It's a good answer to the question? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about? You seem to know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Yeah. Siddhartha Gautama. Sometime around like 5th or 6th century BCE, somewhere in northern India or modern day Nepal, somewhere up there. This philosophy, in a nutshell, is what we call existential philosophy. In other words, life has meaning if you give it meaning. If you live your life in a meaningful way, your life has meaning, right? If you live your life with a purpose, then your life has purpose. If you live your life without meaning and without purpose, then your life is pointless, right? And meaningless and aimless and
Okay, taking a quick
waste
break.
of food. And I had a professor once that told me I was a waste of space. Yeah. Yeah. It was after my exam. I did my exam. It was my piano proficiency exam. Do my piano proficiency exam and look at him like, how'd I do? And he said, Brad, you're just a waste of space. I was like, fuck you very much.
You really did that bad?
I guess. I don't know. I didn't think I did that. I actually I did work on it. Piano's not my thing. So I was a music major. And so saxophone, you use 10 fingers to make one note. Piano, you have to use 10 fingers to make 10 notes. That's like crazy. My brain doesn't work that way. So it was like so hard for me to learn this little thing that I had to do to be proficient in piano. And yeah, it was, piano is just never really my thing. I worked at it pretty hard too, but I think he didn't believe that I worked on it that hard and did that poorly. But I did. I did work on it that hard and did that poorly.
Break
Anyway,
time
cool.
is
Any questions?
over.
About?
We talk here about the Buddha and the Buddha's experiences with death for the first time as an adult. Because most of us, we learn about death when we're a young person, and it comes at various stages, usually unplanned.
He died.
They won't usually set out to teach their kids about death, but instead they find out about death from the reality of it.
Certain death.
Again, as a mimesis, right? We learn through comparative relation, and those first archetypical relationships form deep psychological understandings of how we understand that reality and how we understand it in relation to ourselves and the people we care about, etc. So normally I would talk about that in terms of the Buddha, but instead I'm going to talk about it in terms of Martin Heidegger, who I sometimes refer to as Voldemort for various reasons, most of them having to do with his political stance and his racial stance, some of his personal stances that I find worthy of calling him Voldemort rather than by his name. What is death? So Heidegger gives us a very careful, specific, logical, phenomenological definition of death. Okay, so in Heidegger's text, Being and Time, he redefines death. He gives us an analysis of death. Death is important, as we've already said. Philosophy only begins with a meaningful reflection on the reality of death, and Heidegger does that, and in so doing gives us a new definition of death. And his definition is, loosely translated as this: as death is the utmost possibility of the absolute impossibility of DaSein. So we'll come back to this notion of DaSein later at some point, but for now we can just take it DaSein to
be a particular German word that Heidegger, usually at the time, used to refer to a human person, a human being. Typically, this word would just mean being, and Heidegger's work is an example of ontology, questioning what does it mean to be, but he also was asking that question, who am I? What does it mean to be a human person? And thinking about these things together. And after Einstein's theory of general relativity, understanding the relationship between space-time, as space and time are not two different things, but that space-time is reality, can't be reduced beyond that. So then Heidegger began to understand the human person as DaSein, as being that is there, right? A being that is always in some place, in some time, right? To be is to be in the world, to be is to be with others, DaSein is Mitsein, all these kind of things, right? To be is to be in relationship with, to be in an ecology, to be in an environment, to be surrounded by other humans as part of a society or a social, cultural structure. To be is to be with others. It's just what it means to be, right? To be there. And there is always in some place at some time, surrounded by some set of circumstances. So that's his understanding of human person. We'll come back to that later, although that was a pretty good summary, I think. His definition of death is the utmost possibility of the absolute impossibility of being there, right? So it's what does he mean by this? Death is the utmost possibility, meaning that, let's go back to this sort of systematic philosophy diagram that I've drawn before, right? So what this diagram is attempting to show is how all these different aspects of philosophy relate to one another, the relationship between philosophy and ethics, because it all always pertains to decision making, right? So Socrates defined philosophy as a mode of discourse for the purpose of training the intellect, which has to do with decision making. And so how does one make decisions choosing between possible actions, right? So thinking through logically and taking desire and aesthetics and all of these things into account, right, then there are always going to be a lot of different possible actions one could take. I could take this action, I could take that action. Right now, you could choose to focus on something else, right, or try to multitask, because Heidegger is just so easy for you that you can multitask while you're doing it. Or, focus intently, right? So these are possible actions to take. In the morning, when I wake up, I could either choose to get out of bed or choose to stay in bed.
Never get out of bed.
These are always two possible actions. And then so thinking through situation leads me to take a particular action. If I'm feeling, angry or sad, then that may influence how I get out of bed in the morning, right?
It gets a little bit harder to get out of bed.
Or the possible actions that I take.
Don't you want to get up and do something?
And what Heidegger here is simply saying is that at any given moment, at every given moment, there are lots of possible actions we could take or possible things that could happen to us. One of those possibilities is the utmost possibility, and that's the possibility that is always there, the possibility that is never not there, and that's the possibility of death. So Heidegger's saying that death is the utmost possibility. It's the possibility that's always there. We get this, what could I do today? I could do this, I could do that, I could do this, or I could die, right? Die is always going to be one of the possibilities.
No more me.
And so why think about that? On some level we know that. Why would that begin process of philosophizing? What does death have to do with philosophy?
Existentialism is often discussed as if it's a philosophy of despair.
Well, the answer is also right here, that death is the end of possibilities, that death is the absolute impossibility, right? There are no more, it's the end of all possibilities. Maybe that's a better way to think about impossibility, is one is no longer able to do something, right? And no longer able to be,
You're saying I would be no me?
Right? No longer able to do. that is impossible, right? So then death is the end of all possibilities. So then why would we say that philosophy only begins with a meaningful reflection on the reality of death? The idea is that once we recognize that death is always a possibility, then we begin to run towards, right, and think about all of those other possibilities, right? So then these possibilities take on a new meaning.
He's having an existential crisis.
For example, it's the age-old, thing. Like if you were told definitively that you were going to die in 30 days.
You are going to die soon.
So sad. Nice to know you. What you gonna do with those 30 days, right? How would you spend those last 30 days? And then you think about all these things that you would make priorities to do before you die.
YOLO!
And then, what if after 30 days you don't die? And then do you go back to living the life that you were before? Or do you continue recognizing every day is a gift? Every day is something valuable. Every day is something filled with possibilities. And then you actively choose those possibilities. And you want to make the best possible choices because death is always going to be one of those possibilities. And then that leads you to, making choices, taking actions with a little bit more reflection, intentionality than you might if you had no fear of death. If death was, what was the line from the Mac Miller song?
I got all the time in the world.
Then I'm just, chilling.
I've got all the time in the world, but for now I'm just chilling, right? If you feel like you have all the time in the world, then that's going to lead to certain actions.
Because I have all the time in the world.
Manifesting or actualizing certain possibilities. So when we think about actuality and time and space, that's the Da, right? That being there, being here, being in the moment, being right here, right now. That's what is.
Let's be in the moment.
What is can't be changed, but what is not yet is filled with possibility, and therefore we have some control over, right? But then when it collapses, what the scientists, like Schrodinger and Heisenberg and those guys would call collapse of the wave function.
When the wave function collapses?
Right, when this possibility becomes actuality, then some of those possibilities close off, right? It's no longer possible for Mac Miller to make new tracks. Super sad, right? But also a fact, because death is the end of all possibility, right? It is the utmost possibility. Possibility is always there, of the absolute impossibility of being there, which is always in this process of actualizing possibilities. So we'll come back later to that notion of actualizing possibilities. We'll come back to that later this semester.
Okay, at this point we are only halfway through chapter 4. The title of chapter 4, as I mentioned, is Setting Course, InterCourse, DisCourse, and Death. Now so far we've mostly only talked about the last part, death. But I'm acutely aware that our attention spans are only so long and we need to give our brains a rest before we tackle topics like InterCourse and DisCourse. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give a quick review of the first half of this chapter, then pause to watch another music video before continuing with the second half. And you take all the time that you need in between those two. So let's review. The main point of this chapter is this: philosophy only begins with a meaningful reflection on the reality of death. I describe this as the genesis of philosophy because the word genesis means beginning. So death is the genesis of philosophy. I started by talking about one of my favorite musicians, Mac Miller. Mac Miller died in 2018 at the age of 26. And we analyzed the visual message of his video called Self-Care. In that video, we see him buried alive in a coffin, and he carves the Latin words, Memento Mori, which means remember that you will die. And then he literally breaks through the coffin using those words to create a passageway. I then talked about Jacques Derrida, who died in 2004. Derrida pointed out that the word communication actually means a passageway, and that our words and our art, like Mac Miller's words and Mac Miller's art, continue to communicate even after our death, But Derrida emphasized that the meaning that gets communicated may not be the meaning that the speaker originally intended. In fact, it's probably not going to be, because the words go from one context to another context, and the more different the context is, the more different the meaning is probably going to be. For example, the meaning that Mac Miller was trying to communicate through his words and the visual imagery of self-care is most likely very different from the meaning that you and I take away from it today, years after his death, because the context now is very different than it was when Mac Miller wrote these words and recorded that video. I then introduced existential philosophy. Now, existentialism is the branch of philosophy that's focused on the question, what is the point of existence? I mean, if we're all going to die and eventually be forgotten, then what's the point? Obviously, there are many possible ways to answer that question. One answer is given to us by this philosopher named Siddhartha Gautama, known to most of us by the name the Buddha. Now, the Buddha experienced a profound existential crisis that led him into a deep nihilistic state of depression. He was bothered by all of the random suffering and injustice that he saw around him. He felt powerless to do anything about it, and so he sat underneath a tree and stopped eating. After 2 weeks of that, he had a profound but very simple realization. Life is a series of individual moments. If you waste those moments, your life is meaningless and pointless. But if you spend those moments doing something meaningful, like feeding the hungry or caring for those who are suffering, then those moments are meaningful and your life is meaningful. In other words, life is meaningful if you give it meaning. Death is simply the end of your opportunities to do something meaningful with your life. We then turn to a totally different philosopher, Martin Heidegger. Again, philosophy only begins with a meaningful reflection on the reality of death. Now, Heidegger redefines death in terms of possibility. Death is the possibility that is always there. It's the utmost possibility. And it's also the end of all possibilities. It's absolute impossibility. Therefore, death is the utmost possibility of the absolute impossibility of DaSein, or being there. Now, Heidegger builds on the insights of Einstein's theory of relativity and what was known at the time about quantum physics, and he noticed that being a human person means that we are always already in some place at some time surrounded by others. To be is to be in the world with others. In other words, to be is to be in a context. Context is where meaning takes place. Now, hopefully this was more than just a summary. Hopefully it helped you to review and put all these pieces together, the things that we've seen so far in this chapter. What I'd like you to do next is watch another music video. This one's by Tim McGraw, called Live Like You Were Dying. I think it speaks for itself, and it should be obvious why I included it in the course at this point. But I do want to say that I added this video to the course because a podcast group of students a few years ago had a fantastic discussion about it after watching my original Chapter 4 video, which is just one of many examples of how my students contribute meaningful insights to this course. Indeed, philosophy is a mode of discourse, and discourse is what we're going to talk about in the second half of this chapter. Peace out.